The love story between Laura Ingalls Wilder and Almanzo Wilder is famous for lasting, but their real-life story was full of tragedy. Laura shocked everyone when she published her first book when she was 65 years old. It became the basis for the popular TV show, though it left out many of their problems. They went through terrible things together, like losing their baby son, having their house burned down, and Almanzo getting sick and losing the ability to work. Even though things were hard for them, their bond stayed strong. Some people don't know this, though not everything in the movie is based on Almanzo and Laura's real life. Do you want to know the sad truth about their story? See what happens at the end. Laura Elizabeth Ingalls Wilder was an American author. The Little House on the Prairie line of children's books was based on her own childhood. Charles Philip Lake and Caroline Lake had her on February 7, 1867, in the Big Woods area of Wisconsin. Was born Quiner Ingalls. Born the second of 5 children, after her sister Mary Amelia, she was the second child. Caroline Celestia, Charles Frederick, who died when he was young, and Grace Pearl were her brothers. The place where Laura was born is 7 miles north of Pepin, Wisconsin. It was also the setting for her first book, Little House in the Big Woods, which came out in 1932. Today you can see a copy of this log house at the Little House Wayside in Pepin to remember this place. From a very young age, Laura's life was full of moves because her father was always looking for better jobs. The Ingalls family moved from Wisconsin to Missouri to Kansas when she was 2 years old. They settled near what is now Independence. A tough time came when their family learned that the land they had moved to was part of the Osage Indian Reservation, and they were not allowed to live there legally. In 1871, the family left, but they went back to Wisconsin for a while. This was the time when Charles, Laura's dad, worked hard to get back some land in Wisconsin that he had mortgaged before. Laura's childhood and family life gave her ideas for her autobiographies, Little House in the Big Woods and the beginning of Little House on the Prairie. Sarah was about 7 years old when the Ingalls family moved to Walnut Grove, Minnesota, to live on the banks of Plum Creek in 1874. At first, they lived in an underground sod house, which was a simple but useful structure dug into the ground. The family had a hard time, especially after losing 2 crops in a row. Eventually, they moved to Iowa and opened a hotel there. In 1879, she and her family moved again, this time to Des Moines in Dakota Territory. The family had to deal with the harsh realities of rural life, while her father applied for a homestead. The really bad winter of 1880 to 1881 was written about in Laura's book, The Long Winter. It was one of the worst in Dakota. Des Moines still let the family settle down, which was great for Laura, who met Almanzo Wilder here and her blind sister Mary. Laura went to school, worked part-time, and made friends she will keep for life in Des Moines. She became a teacher when she was 15 years old and taught for a few years in one-room schools in her area. With her teaching jobs, she was able to provide for her family. Laura told them that she didn't really like teaching, but back then there weren't many jobs for women. She was glad to have this chance. Laura Ingalls' early years were marked by moving around a lot, the hard life on the plains, and the close bonds between her family members. These early events would have a big impact on her writing, laying the groundwork for the Little House books that changed modern literature. The story goes that Laura Ingalls married a farmer named Almanzo Wilder. Her book, Farmer Boy, was based on his youth. He later showed up again and again in the Little House books, The Long Winter, Little Town on the Prairie, These Happy Golden Years, and The First 4 Years. Laura had said that Almanzo was a quiet, brave, hard-working man who liked horses, farming, and being a skilled builder and woodworker. It is likely that Almanzo Wilder was born in Burke, New York, on February 13, 1857, but some records show that he may have been born in 1869. Jim Wilder and Angelina Albina Day had 6 children. He was the fifth. A few miles away from Malone, Almanzo grew up on the farm his family owned in rural upstate New York. There were 6 other children on the farm with him: Laura Ann, Royal Gould, Eliza Jane, Alice Maria, and Pearlie Day. Early in his life, he had to work on a farm, which was an important part of his education. He helped his family with gardening from a very young age, doing things like taking care of animals, working in the fields, and taking care of the farm's buildings and equipment. He also learned to love horses and farm, which would be important to him later on. He really liked taking care of the animals on the farm and driving the cows. Laura wrote about Almanzo's childhood in Farmer Boy, which covers the years before his 9th birthday. It was part of her semi-autobiographical Little House series. He wrote about Almanzo as a young boy who was strong, independent, and worked hard in the book. He had to deal with a lot of bigger siblings, especially Eliza Jane, his strong-willed sister. In his early years, he went to school when he wasn't needed on the farm. It was there that he learned how to work hard and do things the right way. In the book, he also wrote about going to county fairs and enjoying the 4th of July. Because their crops failed in Burke in 1870, the Wilder family chose to move west to Spring Valley, Minnesota, and start a new farm there. There, Almanzo continued to work on the farm with his family and began growing seed wheat. Almanzo, his brother Royal, and his sister Eliza went to De Smet, South Dakota, in 1879. There, he met Laura Ingalls for the first time, and a sad love story began. The world saw Laura Ingalls and Almanzo Wilder as important people, and their love story lasted for more than 60 years. They got married in 1885, and while their story sounds like something from a book of stories, the truth about Laura and Almanzo's story is sad. Laura and Almanzo met for the first time in De Smet, which is in South Dakota now. Almanzo had moved to this place with his brother and sister before Laura's family did. Almanzo was 25 years old when Laura was 15 years old, which shocked a lot of people when the modern-day show came out. Many girls in the area fought over Almanzo's attention because Laura said he was a strong and sought-after bachelor. Even though I'm 10 years older than Laura, Almanzo fell in love with her right away, and between the shops in the small town, they kept running into each other. Almanzo and Laura really liked each other, but Laura's dad, Charles Ingalls, told her she couldn't get married until she was 18. Rosa lived 12 miles from her schooling, so Almanzo drove her every day to and from work. The couple often went on long horse rides in the spring. When Ingalls and Almanzo got married, she stopped studying and working as a teacher. They had nicknames for each other from the beginning of their friendship. It was Almanzo who called her Bess, which came from her given name, Elizabeth. Laura called him Manly. That's because Laura was the name of his sister. In De Smet on August 25, 1885, 3 years after they first met, Reverend Edward Brown was the one who married them. They chose to live on Wilder's land and began small-scale farming, seeing as Almanzo had already made some money on his farm. The couple could begin their lives together now that they were married. They also had a daughter named Rose Wilder, who became famous as an author. She was born in 1886 on December 5th. She also had a son in 1889, but he died 12 days before he was even named. They were so upset about him that they never talked about him again. When Laura and Almanzo first got married, things seemed to be going well. But the first few years of living together were full of bad things. It's easy to say that the real story of Laura Ingalls and Almanzo Wilder was so sad because of this. In Laura's book, The First 4 Years, she wrote about the bad things that happened to her and her husband after they got married in 1885. She said, "No one knew what went on in my mind when she talked about the sad things in her book. I would not let my folks know that I was hurt, because I loved them. I hid how much I felt their poverty, their struggles, and their failures from them. These things filled my life, being blown up like scary things in a dream." Almanzo got diphtheria in 1888, just 3 years after they got married. This was one of the sad things that the couple had to deal with. Laura and Almanzo both got the sickness, but Wilder had it worse and died before them. He had neuritis, which is one of the less usual side effects of the illness. Some of Wilder's legs were briefly paralyzed, and when he got better, he still had to use a cane to get around. He couldn't do hard physical work like growing wheat in South Dakota because of his disability. This was one of the terrible things that led to the couple falling into poverty. In 1889, the couple finally broke because they were going through disaster after tragedy. Sarah gave birth to a son in early August. Before he died, the child had only been alive for 2 weeks and had not been named. The two of them never talked about his death, and they never had another child. In the same month, an unknown fire burned their barn and all the hay and grain that was stored there. The couple couldn't gather crops because of several years of drought. This put them in debt, made them sick, and kept them from making a living from their 320-acre prairie land. Besides that, hailstorms and locusts did even more damage to their crops. During the same year, their daughter Rose set fire to their whole house by mistake. There was more going on than just the house fire. A grasshopper plague and a 7-month storm were also bad for the family. Think about how hard it must have been to stay together when there was hail and snow. "That destroyed his health for good," Rose Wilder Lane said, "and 36% interest on loans taken out to buy food to get us off that land. Surprisingly, they made it through everything and stayed together, taking on the problems as a team. Because so many bad things happened in their family, they had to leave De Smet. They rested at Almanzo's parents' house for a year before going to Westville, Florida. Their goal was to find a temperature that would be better for Almanzo's health, but they couldn't get used to the new weather. So in 1892, they had to move back to De Smet. While they were in De Smet, they worked hard. Laura got a job as a seamstress in a dressmaker's shop, and Almanzo worked as a carpenter and as a day worker. Over the next 2 years, they had to be very careful with their money and save a lot. Their funds were all used to buy a piece of land outside of town that wasn't being used yet when they moved their family there in 1894. They lived in a broken-down wood cabin and gave the place the name Rocky Ridge Farm. Their savings were gone, so the family was very poor and had to work several jobs to make ends meet. For 50 cents each, they sold wagons of firewood to make money. Laura also had to take care of the chickens and the horses while her husband worked in the apple orchard and brought kerosene. It was also helpful that their daughter Rose, who was about 8 years old, picked and sold huckleberries. The Rocky Ridge Farm was the couple's last home, and it was here that 10 years into their marriage, they were finally getting close to being financially stable. But they didn't get financially stable right away, and they had to deal with some problems. They put apple trees, but they didn't get any fruit for 7 years. Almarin's parents came over and gave them the key to the house they were renting, which was very helpful. This was the much-needed extra money the family needed. In the end, their land grew to almost 200 acres. They sold their house in town in 1910 and moved back to the farm. At first, the farm was a 40-acre, heavily wooded log house covered in stone that didn't have any windows. After 20 years, though, it became a successful chicken, dairy, fruit, and a house with 10 rooms. Almanzo worked on building Laura her dream home and made sure that her kitchen cabinets were the right size for her small frame. The Little House family finally found a place to live in Missouri. They started a farm there and raised horses, cows, and goats. The Wilders chose to be more diverse by farming based on the climate after they learned some hard lessons in Dakota. They also took part in church and community events. With the start of her writing job in 1911, Laura also helped her family make extra money. She and Almanzo were never rich, but they had enough money to live a good life. In the beginning, she wrote a piece for the Missouri Ruralist called "As a Farm Woman Thinks." A lot of people liked what she wrote about her family, home life, women's jobs, and current events. She kept writing for the Ruralist until the middle of the 1920s, and she also got paid work at the nearby Farm Loan Association to add to her income. Back in the 1920s, her daughter told her to get better at writing. Because her daughter pushed her, she wrote and published Little House in the Big Woods in 1932. It was the first book in the Little House series. Laura's success as an author helped her stay financially stable even when the stock market crashed. She also spoke out about her political views. She was unhappy with the New Deal and the way the government meddled in farmers' lives. She was a libertarian who didn't like how people were becoming more and more dependent on government aid. In terms of politics, she also believed in women's rights and school change. She became more and more angry at the government, which affected her later life and work. The Little House on the Prairie books were American children's books that followed the author from childhood to marriage and adulthood. The themes of these books are strength, family ties, and the difficulties of life on the border. It was at Rocky Ridge Farm that Laura wrote her famous books. At the start of the 1930s. In the end, Almanzo and Laura's daughter Rose moved out, leaving the couple alone since 1935. At the end of their lives, they took care of flower beds, veggie gardens, and farm animals. A lot of her fans came by almost every day to meet her. At the start of their marriage, the couple didn't have to worry about money because they could live alone in their dream house. But by 1949, Almanzo had died after 2 heart attacks. Even though he's dead, Laura stayed on the farm and lived by herself. She was taken care of by her neighbors and friends, and she kept writing to her editors and fans. In 1956, Laura, who was 89 years old, got sick with diabetes and heart problems. She was later sent home, but her health got worse. In 1957, she was 90 years old and died in her sleep at home. She was laid to rest next to Almanzo. Even her daughter, who died in 1968, was buried next to them. The true story of Laura Ingalls and Almanzo Wilders is not as happy as the story in the book. Tragic events shaped their lives. The first 10 years of their marriage were the worst ever. There was hail, drought, blizzards, and fires that destroyed their barns. They also had to deal with being sick, being unable to work, and their daughter setting fire to their house. Aside from that, they lost their second child only 2 weeks after he was born. Still, they didn't give up, and over the next 50 years of their marriage, they were able to get their finances in order. Laura chose to use her Little House books to share her shocking and amazing life.